Black general cuffed by racist cops. His Pentagon call crushed their careers. The autumn air carried a crisp chill as Lieutenant General Marcus Tate's government-issued Suburban pulled into Riverside, Virginia, a small town that would soon find itself at the center of a national conversation. After 6 hours on the road returning from a military conference in Atlanta, his stomach growled at the sight of the Riverside Diner sign glowing warmly against the darkening sky. The 3 stars on his uniform felt heavy after the long drive, but years of military discipline meant his appearance remained impeccable despite the journey. Marcus adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of himself, the silver at his temples contrasting with his dark skin, deep lines etched around his eyes from decades of service to a country that sometimes struggled to recognize him as one of its highest-ranking military officials. At 53, he had navigated battlefields in 3 continents, led counterterrorism operations that saved countless American lives, and now served as one of the Pentagon's most respected strategists. Yet none of that would matter in the next 90 minutes. He slid out of the vehicle, his 6 feet 2 inches frame unfolding with the measured movements of a man accustomed to command. The parking lot was half empty, just a few pickup trucks and sedans scattered across faded parking lines. As he walked toward the entrance, an elderly white couple exiting the diner froze momentarily at the sight of him in his full dress uniform before hurriedly looking away. Marcus had seen that look before: surprise, confusion, sometimes disbelief. He had learned long ago to let it slide off his shoulders like rain. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and grilled onions. A bell chimed as he entered, and a momentary hush fell over the scattered patrons before conversations awkwardly resumed. The hostess, a young woman with bright red hair, smiled mechanically as she led him to a booth by the window. "Coffee, please," Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had guided soldiers through chaos. "Coming right up," she replied, her eyes lingering on his uniform insignia before walking away. Marcus glanced around the diner families finishing early dinners, a few solo travelers hunched over plates, and at the counter, 2 police officers who had swiveled on their stools to observe him with unmistakable scrutiny. Something in their gaze made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, an instinct honed through decades in environments where threats could come from any direction. He picked up the menu but found his attention divided as he noticed the officers speaking to each other in low tones, occasionally glancing his way. Marcus had experienced this before: the suspicious looks, the whispered comments. In his 30 years of military service, he had learned that for some, a black man in a position of power remained an anomaly worthy of suspicion rather than respect. The waitress returned with his coffee. "Know what you want to order, sir?" "The meatloaf special, please," Marcus replied, handing back the menu and taking a sip of the scalding coffee. As she walked away, the bell above the door chimed again. Marcus didn't look up until he sensed someone approaching his table. When he did, he found himself looking at the gold badge of Officer Darren Miller, one of the policemen who had been watching him from the counter. "Evening," the officer said, his partner hanging back slightly. "Mind if I ask what brings you to Riverside?" Marcus had been asked this question countless times in countless small towns, always with the same underlying message: you don't belong here. "Explain yourself." "Just passing through," Marcus replied calmly. "Heading back to D.C. "That's quite a costume you've got on," the second officer remarked, stepping closer. His nameplate read Reynolds. "Halloween's not for another few weeks." Marcus felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. "This isn't a costume, Officer Reynolds. I'm Lieutenant General Marcus Tate, United States Army." Officer Miller's eyebrows raised slightly. "Lieutenant General? That's pretty high up, isn't it?" "Yes, it is." Marcus reached for his wallet. I have identification. Slow movements, please, Miller interrupted, his hand moving to rest on his holster. The diner had gone completely silent now, all eyes on the unfolding scene. Marcus carefully extracted his military ID and held it out. Officer Miller took it, studied it for an unnecessarily long time, then passed it to his partner with a smirk. "This doesn't look right to me," Reynolds said, turning the ID card over in his hands. "Where'd you get this made?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "That's standard military identification, officer. I assure you it's authentic." "Thing is," Miller continued, leaning against the booth, "we got a report about someone impersonating a military officer in town. Serious offense, that." "A report?" Marcus asked, knowing no such report could exist. "From whom?" "Can't disclose that," Reynolds replied. "Mind stepping outside with us to clear this up?" Around him, diners stared, some with concern, others with barely concealed satisfaction. The waitress hovered nearby, his meatloaf special cooling in her hands, uncertainty written across her face. Marcus knew what was happening, had seen it before, had heard the stories from other black officers and soldiers. But never had he imagined it would happen to him, not with 3 stars on his shoulder. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job," Marcus said calmly, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "But I am who I say I am. If you have doubts, I encourage you to call the Pentagon directly. I can provide the number." Miller and Reynolds exchanged glances. "Step outside, sir," Miller said, no longer asking. Marcus considered his options: refuse and risk escalation, comply and suffer humiliation. Neither choice should be necessary for a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the very freedoms these officers were now denying him. "May I at least pay for my coffee?" Marcus asked, maintaining his dignity. "We'll sort all that out afterward," Reynolds said. With the eyes of the entire diner on him, Lieutenant General Marcus Tate, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military, stood up slowly and walked toward the door, flanked by 2 small-town police officers who refused to believe that a black man could rise so high. And as the door closed behind them, what should have been a simple dinner stop was about to become the spark for a nationwide reckoning. The fluorescent lights of the parking lot cast harsh shadows as Marcus stood between the 2 officers. The autumn air had grown colder, but it wasn't the chill that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the familiar territory he found himself in, a place where his achievements, his rank, even his identity were being questioned because of the color of his skin. "Look, officers," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "This is unnecessary. My ID is legitimate. I'm heading back to the Pentagon after a conference in Atlanta." Officer Miller circled him slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "You expect us to believe the U.S. Army would make someone like you a 3-star general?" The words hung in the air, their implication unmistakable. Marcus had heard comments like this before as a cadet at West Point, as a young lieutenant in the field, even as a colonel. But he had hoped those days were behind him. "My service record speaks for itself," Marcus replied, keeping his composure. 30 years of service. Bronze Star. 2 Purple Hearts. And yes, 3 stars. Anyone can buy medals online these days. Officer Reynolds interjected, shining his flashlight directly into Marcus's eyes. "Real convincing setup you've got." A small crowd had begun to gather at the diner's windows, faces pressed against glass, watching the spectacle unfold. Marcus felt their stares like physical weight on his shoulders. "I'm going to reach for my phone," Marcus stated clearly, moving his hand slowly toward his pocket. "I can call my aide at the Pentagon right now. He can verify my identity." "Stop right there," Miller barked, drawing his weapon with alarming speed. "Hands where I can see them." Marcus froze, hands raised to shoulder height, the cold reality of his situation sinking in. 30 years of military service, of jumping from aircraft in a hostile territory, of leading men and women through gunfire and mortar attacks. And here he was more afraid in this parking lot than he had been in any war zone. "On your knees," Reynolds commanded, his own weapon now drawn. "Officers, this is a mistake." Marcus tried again, his mind racing through protocols and procedures, none of which prepared him for this moment. "I am Lieutenant General Marcus Tate." "On your knees," Miller repeated, enunciating each word. Inside the diner, someone had pulled out a phone and was recording. Marcus could see the glow of the screen from the corner of his eye. Whatever happened next would not stay in this parking lot. With the deliberate movements of a man who had given orders far more often than he had received them, Marcus Tate slowly lowered himself to his knees. The concrete was cold and rough beneath him, and the indignity of the position burned through him like fire. "Hands behind your head," Reynolds instructed, moving behind him. As Marcus complied, he thought of his father, a Vietnam veteran who had returned home to face discrimination despite his service. "The uniform doesn't change their eyes, son," he had told Marcus. "But it changes you. Remember that." The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and a murmur went through the growing crowd of onlookers. Some looked troubled, others merely curious, as if watching a television drama unfold in real time. "You're making a serious mistake," Marcus said quietly as Reynolds pulled him to his feet. "One that will have consequences beyond this parking lot." "Save it for the station," Miller replied, leading him toward the patrol car. As they approached the vehicle, another voice cut through the night air. "Wait! Stop!" The trio turned to see the diner's waitress hurrying across the parking lot, her red hair flying behind her. She clutched Marcus's military ID in her hand. "I checked online," she said, slightly out of breath. "He's real. Look." She held up her phone, showing a Pentagon webpage with Marcus's official photo and biography. Officer Miller barely glanced at the screen. "Ma'am, please return to the diner. This is police business." "But you're arresting a 3-star general," she protested. "I Googled him. That's really him." "Impersonating an officer is a serious crime," Reynolds countered. "We're just doing our due diligence." By handcuffing him in public, the waitress, her name tag read Jessie, looked incredulous. "Have you even called to verify?" "Ma'am," Miller's voice hardened, "interfere again and you'll be joining him." Jessie's face flushed with anger, but she took a step back, looking at Marcus with genuine regret in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she mouthed silently. Marcus gave her a slight nod of appreciation before being guided into the back of the patrol car. As the door slammed shut beside him, he caught a final glimpse of the growing crowd and of Jessie, still standing in the parking lot, phone in hand, apparently making a call. Inside the patrol car, Marcus sat upright, military posture intact despite the handcuffs. His mind ran through protocols who needed to be notified, what rights he needed to assert, how to maintain dignity in an inherently undignified situation. "You know," Officer Miller said from the front seat as they pulled away from the diner, "life's a lot easier when people stay in their place." Marcus said nothing, choosing instead to focus on the road ahead, watching as the diner receded in the distance. 30 years of service, and it had come to this handcuffed in the back of a police car in a town whose name few would recognize, all because some couldn't reconcile the color of his skin with the stars on his shoulders. But Marcus Tate had not become a general by accepting defeat. As the patrol car accelerated toward the station, he began to formulate his strategy, knowing that the next few hours would test him in ways that 3 decades of military service never had. The Riverside Police Station was a single-story brick building that might have once been a post office, with an American flag hanging limply from a pole out front. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everyone in an unflattering pale glow. The processing area consisted of a high counter manned by a dispatcher, a few metal chairs bolted to the floor, and walls covered with wanted posters and community notices. Officers Miller and Reynolds marched Marcus through the front door, still handcuffed, drawing curious stares from the two desk officers and a custodian mopping the linoleum floor. The night shift was clearly not accustomed to seeing a man in full military dress being brought in as a suspect. "Got an impersonator," Miller announced to the desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair and deep-set eyes. "Claims to be some big-shot general." The sergeant looked up from his paperwork, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Marcus's uniform and insignia. "Lieutenant General, by the looks of those stars," he remarked, his tone carrying a hint of concern that his officers might have overstepped. "That's what his fake ID says," Reynolds added, tossing Marcus's military identification onto the counter. "Pretty elaborate costume, too." Marcus stood tall despite the handcuffs. "Sergeant," he addressed the desk officer directly, his voice carrying the natural authority of his rank. "I am Lieutenant General Marcus Tate. I'm the Deputy Commander of Strategic Operations at the Pentagon. These officers have made a serious error in judgment that could be rectified with a single phone call." The sergeant picked up the ID, examining it with more care than his officers had shown. "This appears to be genuine military identification," he said slowly. "Anyone can get those made," Miller insisted, though a note of uncertainty had crept into his voice. "I want to make my phone call," Marcus stated firmly. "And I want these handcuffs removed. Your officers have detained a senior military officer without cause, and every minute this continues compounds your department's liability." The sergeant's eyes moved from the ID to Marcus, then to his officers. "Uncuff him," he instructed, his tone suggesting he was beginning to realize the potential severity of the situation. "But Sarge," Miller began to protest. "I said uncuff him," the sergeant repeated, more firmly this time. "And someone get the chief on the phone. Now." Reynolds reluctantly produced the handcuff key and removed the restraints from Marcus's wrists. Marcus brought his hands forward slowly, rubbing the spots where the metal had dug into his skin. "Thank you, Sergeant," Marcus said, his dignified demeanor intact. "Now, I need to use a phone. My staff will be concerned about my whereabouts." The sergeant nodded toward a phone on the counter. "Use this one." As Marcus moved toward the phone, the station door burst open, and a tall, white-haired man in a rumpled suit strode in, his face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of anxiety and anger. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his eyes quickly finding Marcus in his uniform. "I got 3 calls on my way over about officers arresting a general." "Chief Campbell," the sergeant acknowledged, standing a bit straighter. "Officers Miller and Reynolds brought this gentleman in on suspicion of impersonating a military officer." Chief Campbell turned to Marcus, his expression shifting from anger to something approaching horror as he took in the 3 stars on his shoulder. "Sir, I'm Chief Robert Campbell. There appears to have been a misunderstanding." "That's one way to put it," Marcus replied evenly. "Your officers refused to verify my identity, publicly handcuffed me, and brought me here despite multiple attempts to resolve the situation peacefully." Campbell shot a withering look at Miller and Reynolds. "Is this true?" "Chief, we had reason to believe," Miller began. "What reason?" Campbell cut him off. "Did you call the Pentagon? Did you contact military police? Did you run his ID?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "We were going to do that here. After parading him through town in handcuffs?" Campbell's voice rose. "Do you have any idea the kind of situation you've created?" The station had gone completely silent. Even the custodian had stopped mopping to watch the scene unfold. "Sir," Campbell turned back to Marcus, his tone drastically different. On behalf of the Riverside Police Department, I offer my sincerest apologies. This is not how we train our officers to conduct themselves." Marcus regarded him steadily. "Chief Campbell, I appreciate your apology, but this incident reflects a systemic issue that goes beyond training. Your officers saw a black man in uniform and immediately assumed I was an imposter. They didn't seek verification. They didn't extend professional courtesy. They chose humiliation over procedure." Campbell's face reddened further, but he nodded. "You're right, and there's no excuse for it. I assure you, there will be consequences. I still need to make that call," Marcus reminded him, gesturing toward the phone. "Of course," Campbell agreed quickly. "And please, use my office for privacy." He glared at Miller and Reynolds. "You two, wait in the conference room. Don't go anywhere." As Marcus was led to the chief's office, he could feel the stares of everyone in the station following him. The chief's office was modest, a desk cluttered with papers, family photos on the walls, and a window overlooking the station's small parking lot. "Take all the time you need, sir," Campbell said, closing the door behind him. Alone for the first time since entering the diner, Marcus took a deep breath. His hands were steady as he dialed a number from memory, not his aide as he had suggested earlier, but a direct line to General Clifford Morgan, the Army Chief of Staff and Marcus's longtime mentor. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Morgan." "Cliff, it's Marcus Tate." "Marcus." Morgan's tone shifted from formal to concerned. "You should have been back hours ago." "Where are you?" "I'm currently at the Riverside Police Station in Virginia," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level. "I've been detained by local officers who refuse to believe my identity." A moment of stunned silence followed. "Then they did what?" "They arrested me, Cliff. Handcuffed me in a diner parking lot. Brought me to the station. The police chief just arrived and is attempting to manage the situation, but the damage is done." "Jesus Christ," Morgan muttered. Then his voice hardened with the authority of his rank. "Put the chief on the phone. Now." Marcus opened the office door and beckoned to Chief Campbell, who hurried over. "The Army Chief of Staff would like to speak with you," Marcus said, handing him the phone. Campbell's face went pale as he took the receiver. "This is Chief Robert Campbell." Marcus couldn't hear Morgan's exact words, but the chief's expression told him everything he needed to know. Campbell winced repeatedly, occasionally attempting to interject with "yes, sir," or "I understand, sir," but mostly listening in uncomfortable silence. After several minutes, Campbell handed the phone back to Marcus, his hand visibly shaking. "Marcus," Morgan's voice came through the line, "a military escort is being dispatched to your location. They should arrive within the hour. Do you require medical attention?" "No, I'm fine," Marcus assured him. "This will not stand," Morgan continued, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I've informed the Secretary of the Army, who is briefing the Secretary of Defense as we speak. The full resources of the United States military are at your disposal." "Thank you, Cliff," Marcus said quietly. "But what I want right now is accountability, not just for tonight, but for every service member who's faced similar treatment." "You'll have it," Morgan promised. "The escort will be there soon. Stay strong, Marcus." After ending the call, Marcus turned to find Campbell still standing nearby, looking as though he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "General Tate," Campbell began, his voice subdued, "I can't begin to express how seriously we're taking this incident. Actions will speak louder than words." "Chief," Marcus replied, "a military escort is on its way. In the meantime, I'd like my belongings returned and an official statement from your department acknowledging this wrongful detention." Campbell nodded quickly. "Of course. Anything else?" Marcus looked directly into the chief's eyes. "Yes. I want to speak with Officers Miller and Reynolds before I leave." Campbell hesitated for just a moment before nodding again. I'll arrange it." As the chief hurried away, Marcus stood alone in the office, his reflection visible in the darkened window. The stars on his uniform gleamed under the office lights, stars earned through decades of service, leadership, and sacrifice. Stars that, to some, would never outshine the color of his skin. But as he straightened his uniform and prepared to face his accusers one final time, Lieutenant General Marcus Tate knew that what happened next would reach far beyond this small-town police station. The call had been made, the wheels were in motion, and by morning, the nation would be watching. Dawn broke over the Riverside Police Station with the subtlety of an artillery barrage. By 6 a.m., 3 black SUVs with government plates had established a perimeter in the parking lot, while a team of JAG officers in crisp uniforms filed through the front doors. Leading them was Colonel Sophia Washington, a formidable military lawyer whose reputation for precision extended from the courtroom to the battlefield. Inside, Lieutenant General Tate sat in Chief Campbell's office, now wearing a fresh uniform delivered by his aide. He had refused to leave the station until proper procedures were followed, a decision that transformed an already tense situation into what one reporter would later describe as the Pentagon's occupation of small-town America. General, Colonel Washington greeted him with a sharp salute as she entered the office. The Secretary of Defense sends his personal regrets about this incident. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs has requested hourly updates. Marcus returned her salute. "Thank you, Colonel. What's the situation outside?" "Media presence is growing, sir," she reported, her tone businesslike. "The initial video from the diner has gone viral. Current view count is approaching 3 million. The Pentagon press office is preparing a statement, pending your approval." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. In the digital age, injustice traveled at the speed of light. And the officers involved? Officers Miller and Reynolds have been placed on administrative leave, Washington confirmed. Chief Campbell is cooperating fully, as is the mayor. They're quite eager to resolve this situation. "I imagine they are," Marcus replied dryly. A knock at the door preceded the entrance of a young lieutenant carrying a tablet. "Sir, the Secretary of the Army is on a secure line for you." Marcus took the tablet, exchanging a few brief words with his superior before returning it to the lieutenant. "Colonel," he addressed Washington, "we need to proceed carefully. This isn't just about me." "Understood, sir," she replied. "How would you like to proceed?" Marcus stood, straightening his uniform. "First, I want a formal record of last night's events, with sworn statements from all involved. Second, I want a face-to-face with the mayor and town council. And third," he paused, his expression resolute, "I want to address my troops." Washington raised an eyebrow slightly. "Your troops, sir?" "Every man and woman who wears this uniform," Marcus clarified. "What happened here isn't isolated, Colonel. It's part of a pattern that affects our personnel across the country. If it can happen to a 3-star general, imagine what our enlisted personnel face." Washington nodded in understanding. "I'll make the arrangements." Outside the station, the media presence had indeed grown. News vans lined the street. Reporters did live stand-ups with the police station as backdrop, and satellite trucks beamed images across the nation. The story had transcended local interest. It now touched on fundamental American questions of race, respect, and the treatment of military personnel. By mid-morning, Chief Campbell had provided a formal written apology, accompanied by incident reports that notably lacked crucial details about why Marcus had been targeted in the first place. The mayor, a nervous man named Howard Jenkins, had arrived wearing his Sunday best, clutching a folder of diversity initiatives the town had supposedly implemented over the past year. "General Tate," Mayor Jenkins began as they sat in the station's conference room. "On behalf of Riverside, I want to express our deepest regrets about this unfortunate incident. Unfortunate incident suggests an accident. Mayor Jenkins, Marcus replied, his voice steady. What happened last night was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice made by your officers. The mayor squirmed in his seat. Yes, well, we're committed to addressing any biases that may exist within our department. May exist. Colonel Washington interjected, her tone incredulous. What we need, Marcus said, cutting through the tension, is not just promises of future improvement, but acknowledgement of the current problem. Your officers didn't see a lieutenant general last night. They saw a black man they believed couldn't possibly hold my rank. The mayor's discomfort was palpable. General, I assure you, Riverside is not a racist town. I'm not here to condemn your town, Mayor, Marcus replied. I'm here to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else, civilian or military, in uniform or out. At that moment, the door opened and a JAG captain entered with a tablet. Sir, the body cam footage has been retrieved. The room fell silent as the tablet was placed on the conference table. The captain tapped the screen, and suddenly Officer Miller's voice filled the room. I'm telling you, no way that guy's a real general. Probably bought the uniform online. Yeah, Reynolds' voice replied. These guys get more elaborate every year. Remember that one claiming to be a Navy SEAL last summer? At least that was believable. But a black 3-star general? Come on. The mayor's face drained of color as the recording continued, documenting not just racial bias, but a deliberate plan to humiliate Marcus regardless of his identity. When the video ended, Marcus leaned forward. Mayor Jenkins, I think we need to have a different conversation now. By noon, the terms had been set. A complete overhaul of the Riverside Police Department's training protocols, external review of past complaints involving minority citizens, and the immediate suspension of both officers pending termination proceedings. The mayor, now understanding the full gravity of the situation, agreed to all conditions without hesitation. As these negotiations concluded, Marcus received word that the Secretary of Defense himself would be making a public statement in 1 hour. The Pentagon, it seemed, had decided this incident merited the highest levels of attention. In Washington, D.C., news of General Tate's detention had spread through military circles like wildfire. At the Pentagon, service members of all ranks gathered around televisions as the Secretary of Defense approached the podium in the briefing room. Last night, the Secretary began, his voice grave. One of our most decorated officers, Lieutenant General Marcus Tate, was wrongfully detained while traveling in uniform. This incident reflects not only a failure of civilian-military understanding, but raises serious questions about the treatment of black service members in our society. The Secretary continued, outlining General Tate's distinguished career, West Point graduate, combat decorations, leadership in critical operations, and his current role overseeing strategic planning for multiple theaters of operation. Let me be absolutely clear, the Secretary concluded. The United States military stands behind Lieutenant General Tate and all our service members who have faced similar discrimination. We expect a full accounting of this incident, and we will be watching closely as local authorities address this matter. Back in Riverside, Marcus watched the Secretary's statement on a television in the police station's break room, surrounded by his JAG team and several increasingly nervous local officials. The message was unmistakable. What had happened here would have consequences far beyond this small town. As the statement concluded, Colonel Washington approached. Sir, your vehicle is ready. The escort is prepared to return you to the Pentagon. Marcus nodded, rising to his feet. He had accomplished what he needed to hear, ensuring accountability and setting in motion changes that might prevent similar incidents in the future. But as he prepared to leave, a young desk officer hesitantly approached him. General Tate, the officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sir, I just wanted to say, my brother serves under your command in the 3rd Division. He says you're the finest officer he's ever known. Marcus studied the young man, noting the genuine regret in his eyes. What's your name, officer? Peterson, sir. James Peterson. Officer Peterson, thank you for telling me that. Marcus replied. Remember this day. Remember that wearing a uniform, whether it's yours or mine, comes with responsibilities beyond the badge or the stars. Peterson nodded earnestly. Yes, sir. As Marcus made his way through the station toward the exit, the atmosphere had transformed completely from the previous night. Where there had been contempt and suspicion, there was now deference and regret. Every officer stood a little straighter as he passed, offering respectful nods that had been unthinkable just hours earlier. Outside, the media had grown even more numerous. Cameras tracked his movement as he emerged from the station. Microphones extended toward him as reporters called out questions. But Marcus moved purposefully toward the waiting SUV, his expression revealing nothing of the turmoil of the past 18 hours. Only when he was seated in the vehicle, as it pulled away from the Riverside police station, did Marcus allow himself a moment of reflection. He thought of his father, who had faced similar indignities without the benefit of rank or media attention. He thought of countless other black service members who had endured the same treatment in silence. The SUV accelerated onto the highway, heading toward Washington. Behind him, Riverside grew smaller in the distance, but Marcus knew that what had happened there would only grow larger in the national conversation. His Pentagon call had not just saved his career, it had ignited a dialogue that was long overdue. And as the miles passed beneath the wheels, Lieutenant General Marcus Tate began to formulate his next mission, one that would extend far beyond military strategy to address a battlefield where many Americans fought every day: the struggle for dignity and respect. The following morning, Lieutenant General Marcus Tate stood at his office window in the Pentagon, gazing out at the early risers crossing the massive parking lot. His aide, Captain Michael Chun, entered with a tablet in hand, his expression suggesting the media storm hadn't abated overnight. General, Chun began, CBS, NBC, and CNN are requesting interviews. The New York Times wants to run a profile piece. And sir, he hesitated briefly, the president would like to speak with you 11 o'clock. Marcus nodded, turning from the window. What's the social media situation? Chun swiped through screens on his tablet. Justice for General Tate is trending nationally. The body cam footage leaked online about an hour ago. Pentagon cybersecurity is investigating the source. And the officers? Marcus inquired, his tone neutral. Official termination proceedings began this morning. The police union initially pushed back, but apparently retreated after reviewing the complete footage. Chun looked up from his tablet. Sir, if I may speak freely? Always, Captain. This has become much bigger than Riverside. Military forums are flooded with service members sharing similar experiences. The Army Times is calling it a watershed moment. Marcus absorbed this information thoughtfully. What had happened to him was unfortunately not unique. The only difference was his rank had forced people to pay attention. Now, he faced a critical decision about how to use this unexpected platform. Captain, arrange a meeting with the diversity officers from all branches before I speak with the president. And contact General Morgan, I'll need his counsel as well. As Chun departed to make arrangements, Marcus's secure phone rang. The caller ID showed it was his sister, Dr. Amara Tate, a professor of African American Studies at Howard University. Marcus, her voice came through, a mixture of concern and pride. You're all over the news. So, I've been told, he replied, allowing himself a small smile at the sound of her voice. Mom's worried sick, of course, even though she sees you're fine. Dad's, she paused. Dad's not saying much. but he's been watching every news segment. Marcus understood the significance. Their father, retired Master Sergeant James Tate, had endured similar incidents throughout his military career, but in an era before cell phone cameras and social media. His silence spoke volumes. "How are you really doing?" Amara pressed. "I'm fine," Marcus assured her automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, I'm angry. Not just for myself, but because this happens every day to people who don't have stars on their shoulders to protect them." "Exactly," Amara agreed. "That's why your voice matters right now. This isn't just about one incident or two bad officers. This is systemic." After promising to call their parents later, Marcus ended the conversation and turned his attention to preparation. By the time he entered the conference room for his meeting with military diversity officers, he had formulated a clear vision for moving forward. The meeting proved illuminating. Representatives from each service branch shared statistics and stories patterns of treatment that crossed geographical and institutional boundaries. What happened in Riverside was merely the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. "The problem, sir," noted Commander Janelle Roberts from Naval Operations, "is that most incidents go unreported. Personnel fear repercussions or believe nothing will change. Or they're told to just shake it off," added Colonel Darius Jackson from the Air Force. "To not make waves." Marcus listened intently to each contract. By the end of the session, the path forward had become clearer, not just addressing individual incidents, but creating systemic changes that would support service members facing discrimination both within and outside military installations. At precisely 11 o'clock, Marcus was escorted to a secure conference room where a direct line to the White House had been established. The president's voice came through with crystal clarity. "General Tate," the commander-in-chief began, "I've been briefed on the situation. First and foremost, I want to personally apologize that this happened to you." "Thank you, Mr. President," Marcus replied. "But with respect, I'm more concerned about addressing the broader issues this incident highlights." "As am I," the president agreed. "Which is why I'd like you to lead a special task force on the treatment of military personnel, with particular attention to racial disparities. The American people need to hear from someone with your experience and credibility." Marcus considered this carefully. "Sir, I'm honored by your confidence. But this can't be just another committee that produces a report nobody reads. We need actionable outcomes. You'll have my full support," the president assured him. "Draft your proposal, select your team, and we'll announce it at next week's press conference. The Secretary of Defense speaks highly of your strategic thinking. Now, we need it applied to this battlefield." After confirming details, the call ended. Marcus sat alone in the conference room for several minutes, contemplating the magnitude of what lay ahead. The incident in Riverside had thrust him into a spotlight he had never sought, but perhaps it was where he needed to be. By late afternoon, news outlets across the nation had shifted from simply reporting the incident to exploring its implications. Military analysts discussed the broader context of race relations within the armed forces. Civil rights leaders pointed to similar patterns in civilian encounters. Conservative commentators debated whether the officers' actions were justified given concerns about stolen valor cases. In the midst of this growing media storm, Marcus received an unexpected call. The Riverside Diner's waitress, Jessie Turner, had reached out through official channels, asking to speak with him. "General Tate," she began when they connected, her voice nervous. "I wanted to apologize for not doing more that night." "MS. Turner," Marcus replied warmly. "You did try to help. I remember that." "Not enough," she insisted. "But that's not why I called. There's something you should know. This wasn't the first time those officers have done this. They've targeted other military personnel before, especially minorities. People in town just looked the other way. Marcus sat forward in his chair. Do you have details? Names? Better, Jesse replied. I have statements from 5 people willing to come forward now that those officers are being held accountable, and security footage from the diner going back months. This was potentially crucial evidence of a pattern of behavior, exactly what would be needed to ensure lasting change rather than a temporary response to a high-profile incident. MS. Turner, we're doing the right thing, Marcus assured her. I'll have someone contact you immediately to collect these statements. They're saying on the news that you might lead some kind of task force, Jesse added. Is that true? It appears so, Marcus confirmed. Good, she said firmly. Because Riverside isn't unique, General. What happened to you happens in small towns across America. After arranging for JAG officers to follow up with Jesse, Marcus turned his attention to the task ahead. If he was going to lead this initiative, he would approach it with the same strategic rigor he applied to military operations. That evening, as Marcus finally prepared to leave his office, General Morgan appeared in his doorway. Hell of a couple of days, Marcus, the Army Chief of Staff remarked, closing the door behind him. Indeed, Marcus agreed, gesturing for his old friend to take a seat. Morgan settled into a chair with a weary sigh. The president tells me you're taking on this task force. You sure about that? It's going to be politically charged, make commanding troops in a war zone look simple by comparison. Marcus nodded slowly. I'm sure. What happened in Riverside? It wasn't just about me, Cliff. It was about every soldier who's faced the same treatment without the benefit of rank to protect them. Morgan studied him for a long moment before speaking. Your father faced this, didn't he? In Vietnam. And after, Marcus confirmed quietly. He never talked much about it, but we knew. The way he tensed up around police, the extra care he took to always have his military ID, even years after retirement. This country asks so much of its service members, Morgan reflected. The least it can do is treat them with dignity. Exactly, Marcus agreed, and not just when they're in uniform. As they continued their conversation, analyzing the challenges ahead, a notification appeared on Marcus's computer and email from Captain Shun with a draft press release about the task force announcement. The subject line read, Operation Earned Respect. Marcus smiled slightly at the military framing. Perhaps that was exactly what this needed to be, not just a committee or an investigation, but an operation with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. Later that night, as Marcus finally arrived home to his Alexandria townhouse, he found a small package on his doorstep. Inside was a folded American flag with a note from an anonymous sender. Thank you for your service, all of it. As he held the flag, Marcus thought about what it represented, the ideals America proclaimed versus the reality many citizens experienced. The gap between them was where his new mission would focus. His phone buzzed with a text from his father, breaking his customary silence on the matter. Proud of you, son. Make it count. And in that moment, Lieutenant General Marcus Tate knew that while the incident in Riverside had been a personal humiliation, its aftermath offered a rare opportunity, a chance to create meaningful change for service members across the nation. The 3 stars on his shoulder had always represented responsibility, but never more so than now. 1 week after the Riverside incident, the East Room of the White House was prepared for a major announcement. Military leaders, civil rights advocates, police reform experts, and select media representatives gathered in anticipation. The room hummed with conversation as Lieutenant General Tate entered alongside the President and Secretary of Defense, a visual statement of unified purpose across civilian and military leadership. Marcus stood tall in his dress uniform, stars gleaming under the lights as the President approached the podium. Today, the Commander-in-Chief began, we address an issue that strikes at the heart of our national values. When those who serve this country face discrimination because of the color of their skin, even while wearing the uniform of our armed forces, we must acknowledge a fundamental failure in our social contract. The president continued, outlining statistics on racial disparities in civilian-military interactions before turning to introduce the initiative. That is why I am establishing the Presidential Task Force on Respect and Recognition for Military Personnel, to be led by Lieutenant General Marcus Tate. This task force will examine patterns of discrimination, recommend policy changes, and create new training protocols for both military and civilian authorities. Marcus stepped forward to the podium, feeling the weight of expectation in every gaze fixed upon him. "Thank you, Mr. President," he began, his deep voice commanding the room's complete attention. What happened in Riverside was not an isolated incident. Across this nation, service members, particularly those of color, face similar treatment every day. He detailed the task force's 3 core objectives: documenting the scope of the problem, developing integrated training between military and law enforcement agencies, and creating clear protocols for verification of military personnel by civilian authorities. This is not just about preventing humiliation, Marcus emphasized. It's about honoring the commitment we make to those who serve. When someone wears the uniform of the United States military, they deserve recognition of their sacrifice regardless of race, gender, or background. As he concluded his remarks, the assembled press erupted with questions. Marcus fielded them with the calm precision that had characterized his military career, neither downplaying the challenges ahead nor overpromising results. When asked whether he harbored resentment toward the Riverside Police Department, Marcus's response reflected the measured perspective that had made him an effective leader. "This isn't about one department or 2 officers," he explained. "It's about systemic issues that require systemic solutions. My focus is on moving forward with constructive change." Following the announcement, Marcus wasted no time assembling his team. The task force headquarters was established in a Pentagon annex, where experts from diverse backgrounds began the process of gathering data and testimonies. Dr. Eleanor Richardson, a sociologist specializing in military-civilian relations, joined as research director. Colonel Jackson from the Air Force and Commander Roberts from the Navy brought their respective services perspectives. Captain Shun served as operations coordinator. To ensure objectivity, Marcus also recruited Chief Michael Brennan, a respected police trainer from Chicago with experience in community relations, and Dr. Amara Tate, whose academic expertise provided valuable theoretical framing. At their first full team meeting, Marcus outlined his vision. "This isn't just another government committee," he emphasized, standing before a wall map of the United States already dotted with pins indicating reported incidents. "We have 6 months to produce not just a report, but a comprehensive action plan with buy-in from both military and civilian agencies." The challenge, Dr. Richardson noted, is that these incidents often go unreported. Service members are conditioned to handle it without complaint. "Exactly," Marcus agreed, which is why our first phase involves creating secure channels for personnel to share their experiences without fear of repercussion. Within days, those channels were established a dedicated hotline, encrypted online portal, and scheduled listening sessions at major military installations. The response was overwhelming. Stories poured in from across all branches of service, accounts of humiliation, disrespect, and discrimination that painted a disturbing pattern. A Marine gunnery sergeant detained while jogging near his base in North Carolina. An Air Force captain questioned repeatedly while shopping in uniform in Arizona. A Navy lieutenant commander handcuffed while waiting for a tow truck in Mississippi. Each story reinforced what Marcus already knew: the incident in Riverside represented a widely shared experience among military personnel of color. 3 weeks into the task force's work, Marcus received a call from Chief Campbell in Riverside. "General Tate," Campbell began, his voice carrying a mix of deference and anxiety, "I wanted to update you personally. Both officers have been officially terminated. We've implemented new training protocols and established a military liaison office to improve relations with service members passing through our jurisdiction." "That's good to hear, Chief," Marcus replied. "But is it changing the culture?" "That's the harder part." Campbell hesitated. "It's a process, sir. Not everyone understands why this has become such a big issue." "Because it always has been a big issue, Chief. Just not for everyone." Marcus paused, then continued more diplomatically. "Your department could serve as a case study in transformation if you're willing to be transparent about both successes and challenges." The conversation ended with Campbell agreeing to document Riverside's reform efforts for the task force's consideration, a small victory in a larger campaign. As weeks turned into months, the task force's work gained momentum. They conducted interviews across the country, compiled statistical analyses, and began drafting recommended protocols. Marcus himself led key engagement sessions, his personal experience lending credibility to the initiative. At a town hall meeting with enlisted personnel at Fort Bragg, a young specialist raised his hand during the Q&A session. "General," he began, his voice slightly uncertain, "all due respect, but will any of this really change things on the ground? My dad served 20 years, and he dealt with the same stuff we're talking about today." Marcus regarded the young soldier thoughtfully. "That's the critical question, specialist. The difference now is that we have leadership attention, public awareness, and documented patterns that can't be dismissed as isolated incidents. But ultimately, change happens person by person, interaction by interaction." He stepped away from the podium, addressing the soldier directly. "Your father's experience matters. Your experience matters. And this time, we're not just talking about the problem, we're creating specific protocols and accountability measures to address it." The specialist nodded, seemingly satisfied with the response. But later, as Marcus reviewed his notes from the session, he reflected on the underlying skepticism. The young soldier wasn't wrong. Decades of well-intentioned initiatives had produced limited change. This effort would need to be different. That evening, in his temporary quarters, Marcus received an unexpected package, a letter from Jessie Turner, the waitress from Riverside, along with a thumb drive. The letter explained that following his visit, she had organized local residents to document their interactions with law enforcement, particularly focusing on treatment of military personnel and minorities. The thumb drive contained dozens of statements, creating a community-level accountability system. "What happened to you was a turning point for our town," Jessie wrote. "Some people are still resistant, but others have found their voice. We're watching now. We're speaking up." This grassroots response represented exactly the kind of sustained engagement needed for lasting change. Marcus immediately directed Dr. Richardson to analyze Jessie's model for potential broader application. For months into the task force's mission, they presented preliminary findings to a joint session of military leadership. The data was compelling statistical evidence of disproportionate treatment, geographic patterns of incidents, and concerning gaps in existing reporting mechanisms. The most troubling finding, Marcus explained to the assembled leaders, is how normalized these experiences have become. Many service members consider discriminatory treatment an expected part of wearing the uniform while being a person of color. General Morgan, who had been a steadfast ally throughout the process, addressed his fellow commanders. "Gentlemen, ladies, this is fundamentally a readiness issue. If our personnel are experiencing this treatment, it affects unit cohesion, morale, and ultimately our operational capability. This framing connecting discrimination to military readiness proved effective in securing additional resources and command emphasis. By month 5, the task force had developed a comprehensive set of recommendations, including standardized verification protocols for civilian authorities interacting with military personnel, joint training between military police and civilian law enforcement in areas surrounding major installations, a secure reporting system for incidents, with quarterly review by senior leadership, revision of military legal assistance programs to better support service members facing discrimination, public education campaigns about military ID recognition and appropriate interaction procedures. As the task force prepared their final report, Marcus received notice that the president wanted to review their recommendations personally before public release. This high-level attention underscored the political significance the initiative had attained for better or worse. They're worried about pushback, Dr. Richardson observed during their preparation session. Police unions, certain political factions. Probably, Marcus acknowledged. But the data speaks for itself. And this isn't about pointing fingers, it's about creating better systems. The night before their White House presentation, Marcus found himself unable to sleep. He stood at his hotel window, looking out at the Washington Monument illuminated against the night sky. His thoughts turned to his father, what he had endured, what he had taught his children about navigating a world that often judged them by their skin rather than their service or character. His secure phone buzzed with a text from Amara. "Dad's coming tomorrow." Said he wouldn't miss it. This unexpected news settled something in Marcus's mind. Tomorrow wasn't just about policies and protocols. It was about acknowledging a reality that had been ignored for too long. It was about ensuring that the next generation of service members wouldn't face the same treatment his father had endured, that he himself had experienced despite his rank. With renewed clarity of purpose, Marcus returned to his briefing notes, refining key points until dawn broke over the Capitol. The task force's recommendations were sound, their evidence compelling. Now they needed to ensure that implementation would be equally robust. As morning arrived, bringing with it the day of their White House presentation, Lieutenant General Marcus Tate prepared to face what might be the most important briefing of his distinguished career, not on battlefield strategy or geopolitical threats, but on the fundamental promise America made to those who served under its flag. The East Room of the White House had never felt more consequential to Marcus than it did that morning. High windows cast natural light across the historic space as staff made final preparations for the briefing. The task force members arranged their materials at the long table, each bringing specialized expertise to what had become a comprehensive examination of military-civilian interactions. Marcus stood quietly near a portrait of Theodore Roosevelt, reviewing his opening remarks one final time, when a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Master Sergeant James Tate, Rhett, now in his 70s but still standing ramrod straight, entered the room with Amara at his side. Though time had silvered his hair and deepened the lines in his face, the senior Tate's eyes remained sharp and observant. "Dad," Marcus greeted him, crossing the room to embrace his father. "I didn't expect you until later." "Couldn't miss the preparation," the elder Tate replied, his voice carrying the slight rasp of age, but none of its frailty. "Some battles are won before the first shot is fired." It was a saying he had often repeated during Marcus's childhood, a lesson in the importance of planning and preparation. Today it carried additional significance. "Mr. Tate," Colonel Jackson approached, extending his hand. "Your son has told us a great deal about your service." "Has he now?" James Tate raised an eyebrow at his son before shaking the colonel's hand. "Well, I'm here to see him finish what Riverside started." As other team members introduced themselves, Marcus observed his father's interactions, the way he asked pointed questions about implementation plans, his keen interest in enforcement mechanisms. Despite his careful neutrality throughout his military career, James Tate had always been acutely aware of the issues his son's task force now addressed officially. The family moment was interrupted as presidential aides entered to announce the commander-in-chief's imminent arrival. James and Amara were escorted to their seats while the task force took positions around the briefing table. The president entered without ceremony, moving directly to greet each team member before taking his seat at the head of the table. "Before we begin," he said, looking directly at Marcus, "I want to commend this task force for completing such thorough work in a compressed time frame. Now, General Tate, please walk us through your findings." Marcus activated the presentation screen and began with stark statistics. "Mr. President, in the past decade, we've documented over 5,000 incidents where military personnel of color faced discriminatory treatment from civilian authorities. 62% occurred while service members were in uniform." The briefing continued methodically, each task force member presenting their section of the findings. Dr. Richardson covered demographic patterns. Colonel Jackson detailed impacts on military readiness and morale. Commander Roberts presented case studies from different regions. Chief Brennan outlined gaps in police training related to military identification. Throughout the presentation, Marcus noted the president asking incisive questions, particularly about implementation challenges. When they reached the recommendations section, Marcus took the lead again. "We've developed a three-tiered approach," he explained, displaying a detailed implementation timeline. "First, immediate protocols for verification of military personnel by civilian authorities. Second, integrated training programs between military and civilian law enforcement. Third, long-term cultural and policy changes to address underlying issues." The president studied the implementation costs. "This is more extensive than I anticipated, General." "Yes, sir," Marcus acknowledged. "But addressing systemic issues requires systemic investment." The commander-in-chief nodded slowly. "I agree, but there will be resistance, political and institutional. There always is when addressing fundamental problems," Marcus replied, "which is why our implementation strategy includes building coalitions across political lines. This isn't about left or right, it's about honoring commitments to those who serve." As the briefing concluded, the president stood to address the room. "This represents exactly the kind of thorough, solutions-oriented approach I requested. I'm approving the full implementation of these recommendations with a public announcement this afternoon." A sense of accomplishment moved through the room, tempered by awareness that the harder work of implementation still lay ahead. As staff prepared for the public event, Marcus found his father standing alone near a window, looking out at the rose garden. "What do you think?" Marcus asked, joining him. The elder Tate didn't immediately respond, his gaze still fixed on the garden outside. Finally, he turned to his son. "When I was a young sergeant in Vietnam," he began, "my commanding officer told me I'd never make master sergeant because certain people shouldn't have that much authority." Marcus listened silently. His father rarely spoke about such experiences. "I made master sergeant anyway," James continued. "But when I came home on leave wearing those stripes, a police officer in Mississippi made me spread eagle on his cruiser because he said I was impersonating a real soldier." He turned fully to face his son now. "I never told you that story. There are dozens I never told. We just handled it. That was the expectation. It shouldn't have been," Marcus said quietly. "No," his father agreed. "It shouldn't have been. "What you're doing here," he gestured to the task force materials. "It's long overdue. But it's only paper until someone enforces it." "That's the next battle," Marcus acknowledged. James Tate nodded, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "And you've positioned yourself well for it. Your mother and I were proud of you, son. Not just for the stars, but for this." This rare moment of explicit paternal approval strengthened Marcus's resolve for the public announcement to come. That afternoon, the White House briefing room was filled beyond capacity. Network cameras lined the back wall as journalists from across the nation crowded the space. At precisely 2 p.m., the press secretary introduced the president, who spoke briefly before yielding the podium to Lieutenant General Tate. Marcus approached the microphone with measured steps, aware that his father and sister were seated in the front row. His uniform, with its 3 stars gleaming under the lights, represented not just personal achievement, but institutional authority he was now leveraging for systemic change. 6 months ago, he began, his deep voice carrying through the room without need for amplification. "I was handcuffed in a diner parking lot while traveling in uniform." That incident sparked a national conversation about how we treat military personnel, particularly those of color, in everyday interactions. He continued, outlining the task force's key findings without sensationalism or political framing, letting the facts speak for themselves. When he reached the recommendations section, Marcus emphasized the collaborative approach they had taken. These solutions were developed with input from military leaders, law enforcement professionals, civil rights experts, and most importantly, service members themselves. They represent not an indictment of any institution, but a roadmap for improvement across all institutions. As questions began, Marcus demonstrated the same steady leadership that had characterized his military career: direct, thoughtful, and focused on solutions rather than blame. When one reporter asked if the officers from Riverside had been treated too harshly, Marcus's response captured the essence of the task force's work. "This has never been about 2 officers or 1 incident," he explained. "It's about recognizing patterns and creating systems that prevent similar incidents in the future. The question isn't whether those officers were treated harshly, it's why we didn't address these systemic issues years ago." Another reporter pressed on potential resistance from police unions. "Chief Brennan would be best positioned to address that," Marcus replied, deferring to the police expert on their team, a deliberate demonstration of the coalition they had built. Chief Brennan stepped forward. "We've actually consulted with major police organizations throughout this process. Many recognize that clear protocols benefit their officers as much as military personnel. Uncertainty creates risk for everyone involved." As the briefing continued, Marcus noted the subtle shift in questioning from skepticism about the problems to practical concerns about implementation. This indicated progress in public understanding, a critical component for sustained change. Finally, a veteran correspondent from a major network asked what became the defining question of the session. "General Tate, what would you consider success for this initiative 5 years from now?" Marcus considered the question carefully before responding. "Success would be when a young soldier of any race can stop for dinner in any town in America, wearing their uniform with pride, and be recognized for their service rather than questioned about their identity. Success would be when the experience I had in Riverside becomes truly exceptional rather than merely unusual enough to make headlines." He glanced briefly toward his father before continuing. "Success would be fulfilling the promise we make to everyone who puts on the uniform that their service will be honored, their identity respected, and their dignity preserved." As the briefing concluded, the task force's report was simultaneously released online. Hundreds of pages of data, testimonials, and recommendations made available for public scrutiny. Marcus had insisted on this transparency, believing that public engagement was essential for lasting change. Outside the White House, as the task force members prepared to depart, they were met by an unexpected gathering. Dozens of veterans in partial uniform had assembled, many holding signs with the task force's unofficial motto, "Earned Respect." As Marcus and his team emerged, spontaneous applause broke out. Among the gathered veterans, Marcus recognized faces from across service branches and eras, including several who had shared their stories with the task force. Their presence represented the true constituency for this work, those who had served and those still serving. James Tate, standing beside his son, surveyed the gathering with an expression that mixed surprise with something deeper, perhaps recognition that the silence of his generation was finally giving way to the voice of his sons. As journalists captured this moment for evening newscasts, a young Army specialist approached Marcus with an outstretched hand. "General Tate," she said as they shook hands, "thank you for saying what many of us couldn't." "The hard part comes next," Marcus replied honestly. "Implementation requires vigilance from all of us." "We'll be watching, sir," she assured him, gesturing to the gathered veterans. And speaking up, as the day drew to a close, the Tate family, Marcus, his father James, and sister Amara found a quiet moment away from the crowds and cameras. They sat together in Marcus's Pentagon office, the task force report open on his desk. "So," James Tate said finally, breaking a comfortable silence, "what happens now?" Marcus looked at his father, the man who had navigated military service in an era when speaking out carried far greater risk, who had taught his children to excel in systems not designed for their success. "Now," Marcus replied, "we ensure this doesn't become just another report gathering dust. We've secured initial implementation funding, established oversight mechanisms, and built unusual coalitions. But ultimately, it will depend on continued attention, both institutional and public." Amara, who had contributed both academic expertise and personal perspective to the task force, added her assessment. "The media cycle will move on, but the structures we've created should remain. That's the real achievement here." James nodded slowly, turning the pages of the report. "You've done good work, both of you." Coming from a man sparing with praise, this simple acknowledgement carried significant weight. As evening settled over Washington, Lieutenant General Marcus Tate contemplated the journey from that Riverside diner parking lot to this moment of potential transformation. The incident that had begun as a personal humiliation had evolved into an opportunity for institutional change, but only because he had refused to let it be dismissed as an isolated event. The Pentagon call that had confirmed his identity that night had indeed crushed the careers of those officers. But the true impact would be measured in the experiences of countless service members who would never know what might have happened without the protocols and training this task force had set in motion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, implementation battles, resistance from entrenched interests, the constant threat of bureaucratic inertia. But tonight, Marcus allowed himself to recognize the significance of what they had accomplished. Not just a response to one incident, but the foundation for systemic change. And that, he reflected as he closed the report for the evening, was worth far more than any stars on his shoulders. The Riverside Diner looked much the same as it had a year earlier, same neon sign buzzing in the twilight, same pattern of trucks and sedans scattered across the parking lot. But as Lieutenant General Marcus Tate stepped from his vehicle, the similarities ended. This visit had been arranged weeks in advance. The mayor waited nervously by the entrance, alongside Chief Campbell and several town officials. No media had been invited. Marcus had insisted this be a genuine conversation rather than a photo opportunity. "General Tate," Mayor Jenkins extended his hand. "Thank you for coming back to Riverside. "Thank you for the invitation," Marcus replied diplomatically, though they both knew this return visit had been his idea, a way to assess real change rather than reported statistics. Inside, the diner had been reserved for a community dialogue. Around 30 people were already seated: local business owners, church leaders, police officers in civilian clothes, and notably, several military veterans from the area. At a corner table, Jessie Turner sat with a notebook open before her, now the leader of Riverside's Civilian Oversight Committee. Chief Campbell guided Marcus to the central table. "We've implemented all the recommended protocols," he reported, his tone suggesting he expected approval. "Our officers undergo the Joint Training Program quarterly." "And the results?" Marcus inquired, taking a seat. "No incidents involving military personnel in the past 10 months, Campbell stated with evident pride, "and a 60% reduction in civilian complaints overall." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the statistics while reserving judgment. Numbers told one story. Community experience often told another. As coffee was served, Marcus opened the discussion. "I'm not here to evaluate Riverside specifically," he clarified for the gathered community members. "I'm here to understand how these protocols work in practice, what's effective, what needs refinement." For the next 2 hours, he listened more than he spoke. Veterans described noticeable improvements in local police interactions. A Black business owner noted that officers' approach to verification had become more respectful across the board. A police sergeant candidly discussed initial resistance among the rank and file, but acknowledged that standardized procedures had actually simplified their work. Most compelling was Jessie's update on the community oversight initiative she had started. What began as informal documentation had evolved into a structured program, now being replicated in neighboring counties. The key was making it collaborative rather than confrontational, she explained. "We're not just logging complaints, we're tracking improvements and recognizing officers who exemplify best practices." As the conversation continued, Marcus was struck by something his father had told him following the task force's public release. Real change happens locally, face-to-face, long after the cameras leave. Riverside appeared to be proving that principle. Without national attention, this small community had undertaken genuine reform, not perfectly or without resistance, but with measurable results. When the formal discussion concluded, Marcus found himself approached by a familiar face, Officer Peterson, the young desk officer who had spoken to him the night of his detention. "General Tate," Peterson said, now wearing sergeant stripes, "I wanted you to know I've been leading our department's implementation of the verification protocols. It's changing how we work, not just with military personnel, but with everyone." Marcus studied the young officer thoughtfully. Sometimes transformation starts with a single incident that forces us to reevaluate foundational assumptions. "Yes, sir," Peterson agreed. "I just wish it hadn't taken what happened to you to spark that change." As the gathering dispersed, Marcus found himself alone with Jessie for a moment near the diner entrance. "So," she asked directly, "what do you think? Real change or just surface compliance?" "Elements of both," Marcus replied honestly. "But the foundation seems solid. The question is whether it will sustain without external pressure." Jessie smiled confidently. "That's why we built local accountability systems. This isn't just about policies, it's about people watching, documenting, speaking up." Outside, as Marcus prepared to depart, Mayor Jenkins made one final comment that captured the journey Riverside had undergone. "You know, General, when this all started, many here saw it as an attack on our town. Now most see it as the wake-up call we needed." Marcus nodded in acknowledgement. The measure of a community or an institution isn't whether problems exist. It's how those problems are addressed when exposed. Driving away from Riverside, Marcus reflected on the broader national impact of the past year's work. The task force recommendations have been implemented unevenly across the country, embraced enthusiastically in some jurisdictions, adopted reluctantly in others, actively resisted in a few. The work remained incomplete, as such work always does. Yet undeniable progress had occurred. Military personnel reporting of discriminatory incidents had increased initially as barriers to reporting fell, and then begun a steady decline as protocols took effect. Joint training programs between military and civilian law enforcement had expanded beyond the initial pilot locations. Most significantly, what had once been dismissed as isolated incidents was now recognized as a pattern requiring systematic response. Marcus's secure phone rang, displaying his father's number as scheduled check-in as James Tate continued to take an active interest in the initiative's progress. Just leaving Riverside, Marcus reported after they exchanged greetings. Encouraging signs of genuine change. Community level is where it matters, his father affirmed. Speaking of which, that young specialist who approached you after the White House briefing, Turner, I think she's organizing veterans in Atlanta to monitor implementation there. This grassroots activation had proven to be one of the most powerful outcomes of the task force's work. Service members and veterans across the country taking active roles in ensuring the recommendations became reality in their communities. How's the congressional testimony preparation coming along? James inquired, referring to Marcus's upcoming appearance before a House committee. Final rehearsal tomorrow, Marcus replied, focused on sustaining funding for the training programs. They'll try to say it's no longer needed, his father predicted, that the problem is solved. Then I'll remind them of the data, Marcus countered. We've made progress, but we're nowhere near declaring victory. After ending the call, Marcus directed his driver to make one unscheduled stop before returning to Washington, the highway rest area, where he would have stopped that night had the Riverside incident not occurred. It was a small, unremarkable place with vending machines, restrooms, and a few picnic tables. As he stood stretching his legs, a young Army corporal pulled in, clearly returning from leave by her casual clothes and duffel bag. She nodded respectfully upon recognizing Marcus, then hesitated before approaching. General Tate, she confirmed. I just wanted to say thank you. My brother faced a situation like yours in Texas 2 years ago. Nobody believed him because he didn't have your rank to force the issue. Things are changing, Marcus assured her. Not everywhere, not completely, but the protocols are making a difference. Yes, sir, she agreed. My last trip home, I got pulled over for a broken taillight. The officer saw my military ID and actually followed the new verification procedure, professional, respectful, by the book. This small interaction, free from media attention or official documentation, represented the practical impact of the past year's efforts. Not dramatic confrontations or public apologies, but routine interactions conducted with mutual respect. As Marcus returned to his vehicle, he reflected on the journey from that night in Riverside, how a humiliating detention had become a catalyst for examining long-ignored patterns, how institutional momentum had been redirected toward solution rather than denial. His Pentagon call that night had indeed ended careers, but more importantly, it had begun a process of transformation, imperfect and incomplete, but undeniably in motion. The following week, Marcus found himself back in the White House, providing the president with a one-year assessment of the task force initiative. The data showed measurable improvement, a 42% reduction in reported incidents nationwide, successful implementation of verification protocols in 68% of jurisdictions, and enhanced military-civilian coordination in areas surrounding major installations. The progress is encouraging, the president noted, reviewing the statistics, but I'm more interested in your personal assessment, General. Marcus considered the question carefully. We've established a foundation for systemic change, he replied. The protocols are taking root, but cultural transformation moves more slowly than policy implementation. Our focus now must be on sustaining momentum after the spotlight fades. And your recommendation for the next phase? Transition from national directives to local ownership, Marcus suggested. The communities showing the most progress are those where local leaders, military and civilian, have taken personal responsibility for implementation. After the meeting concluded, Marcus walked through the White House corridors alongside his longtime mentor, General Morgan, who had supported the initiative throughout its development. The secretary mentioned you're being considered for a 4th star, Morgan remarked casually. Central Command is opening up next year. Marcus nodded noncommittally. For 30 years, his career path had been clear, each assignment preparing him for higher command, each promotion opening doors to greater responsibility. Yet the past year had revealed a different kind of impact he could have. A lot can happen in a year, Marcus replied, leaving his options open. Later that evening, he found himself on a video call with military leaders from each service branch, the diversity and inclusion officers who had supported the task force's work. The verification protocols are working well, Colonel Jackson reported, but we're seeing inconsistent application in rural areas. And we need to address sustainability, Commander Roberts added. As media attention decreases, so does compliance in some regions. Marcus listened attentively, making notes for future refinements. This was the unglamorous but essential work of institutional change, constant assessment, adjustment, and reinforcement of new patterns until they became standard practice. When the call ended, Marcus stepped onto the balcony of his Alexandria apartment, looking toward the lights of Washington in the distance. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Richardson. 20/20 wants to do a 1-year follow-up piece. Thoughts? He considered the request carefully. Media attention had been crucial for initial momentum, but the work now needed to stand on its merits rather than his personal story. He typed his response, suggest focusing on implementation in diverse communities rather than the Riverside incident. This needs to be about systems, not individuals. As spring turned to summer, Marcus found himself increasingly focused on the long-term sustainability of the changes they had initiated. The challenge was no longer launching new protocols, but embedding them so deeply in institutional practice that they would survive changes in leadership and shifting political winds. During a training session at Fort Benning, a young lieutenant asked the question that had begun to occupy Marcus's thoughts. Sir, what happens to these initiatives when you retire or move to a different command? That, Marcus acknowledged, is precisely the question we need to address. These protocols must become standard operating procedure, not associated with any individual or administration. This recognition led to the final phase of Marcus's strategy, what he privately called institutional anchoring. Working with both military and civilian legal experts, he began the process of codifying the verification protocols and training requirements into formal regulations and procedures that would require active effort to dismantle. By the fall, these efforts were bearing fruit. The Department of Defense incorporated the verification protocols into its official regulations. The Justice Department issued guidelines for law enforcement agencies nationwide. Police academy curricula were updated to include specific training on military identification and appropriate verification procedures. In October, exactly 1 year after the Riverside incident, Marcus was invited to address a joint session of the Congressional Armed Services Committees. As he stood at the podium in the historic hearing room, he saw faces from across the political spectrum, some who had championed the task force's work from the beginning, others who had questioned its necessity or scope. Distinguished members of Congress, Marcus began. 1 year ago, an incident in a small Virginia town sparked a national conversation about how we treat those who wear the uniform of the United States military. Today, I present not just the outcomes of that conversation, but a roadmap for continuing progress. For the next hour, he detailed both accomplishments and ongoing challenges, emphasizing that while incidents had decreased significantly, the work remained incomplete. He concluded with a personal reflection that captured the essence of the year's journey. What happened in Riverside was not about me, Marcus stated clearly. It was about patterns of treatment that many service members have faced for generations. The difference was that my rank forced a response that others could not command. The measure of our success will not be how we treat generals, but how we treat every person who commits to serve this nation regardless of rank, race, or background. The response was bipartisan applause, not for political positioning, but for the undeniable progress toward fulfilling a fundamental obligation to those in uniform. As Marcus left the Capitol that evening, he found his father waiting by the car. James Tate had made a point of attending key moments throughout the year, watching from the background as his son led a transformation he had once thought impossible. "Good session," the elder Tate commented simply as they drove through the Washington evening. They listened. For now, Marcus acknowledged, ever the strategist. The challenge is institutionalizing these changes so deeply that they survive when attention inevitably shifts elsewhere. His father smiled slightly. "That's always been the challenge, son. But you've moved the ball further than most thought possible." They rode in comfortable silence for a while before James spoke again. "Your mother and I were talking the other day about how things might have been different if something like this had existed when I was serving." Marcus glanced at his father, sensing rare openness about experiences long kept private. "How many incidents did you face?" he asked quietly. "Lost count," James replied, looking out the window. "Different times. We didn't have smartphones recording everything. Didn't have 3 stars to make people listen." This simple acknowledgement of what his father's generation had endured without recourse or recognition reinforced Marcus's commitment to sustaining the initiative beyond his personal involvement. The following week brought an unexpected development. Marcus was contacted by the Congressional Black Caucus with an unusual request. Would he consider leading a broader commission on respect and recognition, not just for military personnel, but for all public servants? The proposal would require retiring from active duty, transitioning to a role that bridged military, law enforcement, and civil service. It represented a different path than the 4th Star and Combat Command that had once seemed inevitable. As Marcus considered the offer, he scheduled a private dinner with General Morgan, whose counsel he had valued throughout his career. "They're serious about Central Command," Morgan noted as they discussed his options. "It's been your trajectory for years." "It has," Marcus agreed. "But this past year has revealed a different kind of impact I could have." Morgan studied his protege thoughtfully. "You know, when I first met you as a young captain, I saw your potential for senior command. Still do. But I've also seen how you've managed this task force, bringing together disparate stakeholders, navigating political complexities while maintaining focus on practical outcomes. Those skills are rare. So what's your advice?" Marcus asked directly. "I can't tell you which path to choose," Morgan replied. "But I can tell you this. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on traditional battlefields." 2 weeks later, Lieutenant General Marcus Tate stood in the Pentagon press briefing room, announcing his decision to retire from active duty after 31 years of service to accept appointment as chair of the National Commission on Respect and Recognition. "The work we began following the Riverside incident revealed patterns that extend beyond military personnel," he explained to the assembled press. This commission represents an opportunity to address similar challenges facing all who serve this nation in uniform, in law enforcement, and civil service. A reporter asked the inevitable question, "General, are you giving up the possibility of a fourth star to take this position?" Marcus smiled slightly. "I'm exchanging one form of service for another." The stars were never the point, the impact was always the measure that mattered. In the audience, James and Amara Tate watched with evident pride as Marcus outlined his vision for the commission's work. Among the invited guests was Jesse Turner, whose grassroots accountability initiative had now expanded to over 30 communities nationwide. After the announcement, as congratulations flowed from colleagues and questions from the press continued, Marcus found a quiet moment with his father. "You sure about this?" James asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "I am," Marcus confirmed. "Some would see this as stepping away from power. I see it as stepping toward purpose." His father nodded in understanding. "Your Pentagon call that night didn't just change your path, it changed the path for a lot of others." As they walked together through the Pentagon corridors, a building where both had served generations apart, Marcus reflected on the journey from that riverside parking lot to this moment of transition. What had begun as a personal humiliation had evolved into institutional transformation, and now into a new phase of service focused on extending those same principles beyond military boundaries. 3 stars had compelled attention when a black man in uniform was handcuffed in a small-town parking lot. But it was what happened afterward, the methodical documentation of patterns, the development of protocols, the building of coalitions, the insistence on accountability that had created lasting change. And as Lieutenant General Marcus Tate prepared to exchange his uniform for civilian attire, he knew that the most important battles of his career still lay ahead, not commanding troops in distant conflicts, but continuing the work of ensuring that America's promise extended to all who served, regardless of rank or race. The Pentagon call that night had indeed crushed careers, but more importantly, it had created a foundation for recognition and respect that would outlast any individual or incident. And that, Marcus reflected as he walked toward his future, was the most meaningful victory of his long and distinguished career.